Welcome everyone to day 5, the final day of the South Feminist Futures Festival. Our theme today is reimagining development. This is our second session this morning. Welcome to you all. This session is on social reproduction, climate justice, and a new social contract under the theme. And we are absolutely thrilled to have the panel that we have. Just a little, I'm co-facilitating this with Nancy Kuchingwe. So we're sort of, as South Feminists, we sort of wing it. So, and especially since it's day 5, we're going to wing it a little more. But yeah, so welcome. I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping issues. One is you're welcome to put your comments, where you're from, what you think about the session, about the festival in chat. Use the Q&A function for any questions that you have for the panelists around the discussion. And you have interpretation. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you have a globe which says interpretation. We have interpretation in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. So go ahead and go with the language that you want to. And yeah, that's it. We are going to start with, since this is a festival, we have artists who are joining our sessions. So we are going to start with a dancer, an artist from DRC. Her name is Stephanie Muamba. We're going to start with 2 clips from Stephanie. So yeah, enjoy that. And we'll come back to the panel. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that amazing, beautiful art. Very powerful. We are going to hear from Stephanie, and she's been incredibly generous. And we're going to share another piece from Stephanie at the end of the session. So don't leave. We have more artists at the end of the session, and we'll hear from artists. So don't leave. Don't leave the session as soon as the speakers are done. So yeah, I'm going to start. I'm going to hand this to Rachel. Rachel, if you can just introduce yourself and speak to the question of care work and women in the informal economy, or what we heard Devaki Jain saying, the first sector. I don't know if she said that was her coinage or Sridhata Batliwala's coinage, but yeah, go ahead, introduce yourself. We are absolutely thrilled to have you, and can't wait to hear from you.
Thanks, Nilanjana, and thanks for this opportunity to speak. I'm also equally thrilled to be part of this first of many, I hope, South Feminist Future Festivals, and congratulations to all the work that's gone, and thank you and congratulations for all the work that's gone into this. I'm going to speak to 3 points today in relation to social reproduction, specifically on care work, crises and violence, and engaging in care sectors to reimagine development. And this is a huge topic, so I will whittle it down by drawing on my work at WIGO, which stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, where we work with women informal workers and their advocacy for social protection and childcare. So the first point is to set the backdrop. And I'm sure other speakers will expand on this. The crisis in care is absolutely necessary for capitalist production. Feminist scholars have elaborated on this in the same way as capitalist production depends on and fuels the ecological crisis. And one of the contributions that I think feminist scholarship brings not only to the notion of a crisis in social reproduction is also an understanding that multiple crises can exist in the same space and are interdependent. We cannot look at the COVID-19 pandemic today as a health and economic crisis. It has also intensified the existing care and ecological crises. And as part of that, I think second, and not surprisingly, is that the pandemic has deepened inequalities in the provision of care, both paid and unpaid. WIGO just completed the data analysis from the first round of a 12-city survey covering over 2,000 women and men informal workers across sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Central Europe. And we drew on the networks of informal workers, organizations across 4 sectors, domestic workers, home-based workers, street vendors, and waste pickers. And beyond the dramatic and immediate loss of income and food security, which we know of, brought on by border closures and lockdowns, the sudden increase in care responsibilities is also evident across all cities. There are 5 key ways that we've identified in the research that women explain there's been their increase in unpaid care work. So the first is that lockdowns have meant more people at home and therefore more cooking and cleaning. The loss of income led to doing more care work within the home, so cooking food rather than buying cooked food. School closures increased childcare responsibilities with the additional pressure of homeschooling. Something that's very specific to this crisis as well is the increased hygiene and sanitation protections meant more time was spent cleaning to protect household members. So particularly for essential workers, such as waste pickers or food vendors who were on the streets working during the peak of the pandemic and are still working in the streets today. Finally, there was the lack of support from kin during the lockdown to share care responsibilities and costs. And so what we see is that when we asked women and men what their earnings were like in July, as compared to the lockdown period in April and their previous earnings in January and February, we see that women workers who attested to an increase in care responsibilities during the lockdown were more likely than men who had also reported an increase in care responsibilities to have not regained their past earnings or working hours. And this is a pattern we have seen in previous crises where women informal workers' earnings drop and sometimes never recover as they shift into more vulnerable forms of work due to their care responsibilities. What also comes out in the qualitative research is the physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion expressed by women and worker leaders as a result of the pandemic. And this is made worse by the rise in violence, both at home and in their workplaces. Violence has always been used to assert control over women's labor and bodies. And at home, as households are under greater stress and anxiety, and some men are forced to take on more care responsibilities. One reason for violence against women is to reaffirm these gendered roles around who is the caregiver and who is the care receiver. In their employers' homes, domestic workers see an intensification of violence as well. For live-in domestic workers, they work longer hours, do not have rest days because they cannot leave the house, and are not compensated for this additional work. For migrant domestic workers, many were locked out of their countries without any assistance. And we see also for live-out domestic workers, many lost their jobs and had no access to social protection or relief measures during the lockdown period. In public spaces, women street vendors and traders are shunned, stigmatized, and fined by municipalities, the police, and market leaders for bringing their young children to the markets. They and their children are seen as vectors of the virus. Another way in which violence is being exerted to maintain the crisis in care and enable capitalist production is through economic recovery plans. With a few notable exceptions, such as Argentina and Hawaii, most governments are not considering care policies from a feminist perspective in their recovery plans. And this brings me to my final point about the need for feminists to engage with specific care sectors, particularly elder care and child care. We must reimagine women and their role in care within this sector. I'm grateful to the feminists already in this space and the work they're doing to bring in complexity. The focus on young children's development tends to eclipse women altogether. When women are considered, they are one-dimensional. They are breastfeeding mothers, passive and with endless amounts of time to participate in parenting classes and run community childcare services for free or a meager stipend. This is doused in neo-colonial racist imaginings of women and their children in the global South. This narrative is shifting slowly, and there is growing recognition that women are also working, most as informal workers, or that childcare workers, themselves women informal workers, require living wages and social protection and are organizing for that. However, despite these advances, the instrumentalization of women to better children's development outcomes still prevails. Also strong is the Western notion of mothering that does not recognize the plurality of childcare arrangements across the global South, or the notion that a child can have multiple mothers or multiple carers. If considered, this is by the early childhood development community, it's often essentialized into unpaid community childcare, which is not at all the vision and the resistance that is adopted when thinking about mothering in a different way. And no visions are proposed as to how paid work can complement unpaid care work in a way that does not lead to poverty, physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. Let me clarify that. No vision is presented in these spaces. I know that as a feminist, we have visions around this, but they're not integrating or engaged or engaging in these spaces. Another reason to engage is that childcare provision is already expanding across the global South through the private sector rather than the public sector. There is very little discussion about the public role in the state role in provisioning and financing. And this is only expected to intensify following the pandemic and as austerity measures are imposed. The pandemic has shown a light on the care crisis, and the private sector is ready to seize the opportunity. What do we need to be saying about the role of the state in public provision of childcare services? This is complicated because many women informal workers say they do not want to entrust their young children to the state after years of hollowing out the state through structural adjustment and austerity. They would rather have a sense of ownership, participation, and control over the childcare services that they want to leave their children in. And trust is so key, because the alternative, if they don't trust the childcare service, is that they take their children with them to work or leave them in more insecure situations. How can we reimagine the role of the state to finance, facilitate, and regulate while retaining the qualities of community care, trust, and trust that are most valued by caregivers? No one is speaking about this in the childcare sector today. And finally, there's the ecological crisis. Will place increasing strain on how women care and work, and how men care and work. And as feminists, we're uniquely placed to be making these linkages in diverse spaces, within our own movements, environmental movements, and in spaces where care policies are defined, financed, debated, and hopefully resisted. So that's it for me for now. Thank you, Nilanjana.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for framing these issues around informal sector workers, the violence that they've experienced, particularly during this COVID pandemic, the question of public policy and the way it has really not at all learned any lessons or drawn any new ideas from this crisis, but has been quite happy to continue to dump additional burdens on households, which means it's on women, on households and communities. The raising the question of motherhood and mothering and the exploitation that it has become. Even though we romanticize it, it's the more we have, when we don't have public policies that center care and parenting, mothering, it gets dumped on it gets dumped into women are obliged to shoulder that burden. Meanwhile, profits are being made on the other end of the scale. So really, we continue even through this pandemic to be giving more and more subsidies to capital. So that's really the framing that we need, and you've put the issues on the agenda really that we need to talk about and push in public policy. We're going to follow this with Amira. Amira, please could you introduce yourself and give expand on what Rachel has been saying. The theme is reimagining development. We're really pleased to hear from you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. So my name's Amira Sawas. I currently work for ActionAid UK, but I guess I'll just reflect more on my broader career, because I think some of the insights relevant to this conversation are also, you know, what I did before was quite interesting. So just a caveat, I am from the UK. I'm, you know, the product of colonization. You know, my background is Syrian, so I grew up very much kind of cognizant of sort of the impacts of colonial histories, and I wanted to do something with my life that tried to use my privilege, I suppose, to support feminists in the global South. But yeah, just to caveat, everything I say is like very cognizant of where I'm sitting and sort of the privileges I have in these spaces. So I was an academic before. I did a PhD which looked at water, climate change and women's rights, focused on Pakistan. I then worked in Pakistan for about 10 years with the women's movement mainly, but also, you know, other movements on generating knowledge around climate justice, around displacement, around basically new visions of development in the country. And sort of, I suppose what I'm going to talk about is that knowledge power element. Certainly Pakistan has been branded in a very particular light by, you know, the external. You know, growing up in the UK, there's a huge Pakistani diaspora, and the othering of Pakistani people was quite immense. And that's why I sort of ended up going in that direction, just wanting to contribute and support in a more, in a less biased way, basically, and just find ways to, again, use my privilege to support and work with people there to understand what's going on, what they want from their future. So I guess what I'm trying to do is decolonize as a Northerner, and that sounds really problematic, but hopefully with regards to what we've been talking about this morning, there's something interesting in there. So some examples of the work I've done that cross the topics that we're talking about. So I've worked on violence and environment in cities, and I've worked on the impacts of climate change and climate change responses. And so a lot of what I've done, and it's been in like deep partnership with you know, feminist academics sitting in Pakistan. So I work a lot with an organization called Karachi Urban Lab, and the academics there, Professor Nosheen Anwar, for example, we've worked together for many years, and, you know, really she's the leader in the situation, and we kind of reflect together, but I've just learned so much from working with her. So one of the things that we've done is develop a participatory, or sort of build on participatory methodologies with young people who want to get into research and policy influencing around this space. So what you tend to see, you know, a lot of research funds, they come from the north. A lot of the universities sitting in, certainly in Pakistan and Jordan and other countries where I've worked, that there's a limit like on academics purely because they don't have, you know, the institutions don't provide them with the time, the space and the finances to go out and do more original work. So they're often doing it sort of outside their day jobs. And that's, you know, we have different privileges sitting in the north, you know, we get money, we can, and then that's why we have this kind of northerners flying in, not really engaging, and then writing about places and issues, you know, from a very top down kind of othering perspective. So what we did was try to channel money from northern institutions into southern institutions, and then set up a framework where, you know, research assistants could come in and have, you know, full-time jobs for 2 or 3 years on a project. And those research assistants would be from the, you know, socioeconomic background or linguistic background of the communities that we were working with. So it was really just a way to try and do participation in a much more systemic and meaningful way. So one of the projects on violence, so that looked at violence in the broadest sense, in 12 neighborhoods across 2 cities in Pakistan. And this involved those research assistants working 3 days a week with those communities. So being with them, witnessing, doing different forms of focus groups, observations, and also participatory photography. And we started to see some really critical links between climate impacts and violence, and particularly gendered forms of violence that were emerging that were not, you know, they're visible if you're living it, right? But from the outside, that visibility is not so clear. So we started to see that during times of floods, you know, as Rachel was saying, you know, under, you know, unpaid care burdens were exacerbated. They were exacerbated for men as well, but in a different kind of way. Of course, women, you know, generally took a much larger burden of it, but men sort of needing to live up to their masculinity and breadwinning responsibilities and being unable to do that as daily wage earners when their houses were being flooded, having to stay at home and try and protect the house, but then that kind of overlapping into heightened forms of domestic violence because the frustrations of not being able to live up to those masculinities were bubbling over and affecting women's and, you know, girls' lives much more severely than they normally would. And, you know, in times of drought, sort of seeing who gets the burden, you know, who feels it. And the way that we talk about it is there's a physicalness. It physically affects people's health and their bodily integrity and their quality of life in different ways. And one of them is, you know, embodying water scarcity. So who feels it more at the household level? It is women and girls at the end of the day. So they're the ones who have to manage in the household when the water scarcity is more severe. In the setting in Pakistan where we were working, it's not really acceptable for, you know, women and girls within those communities to go out and just do stuff, right? So their mobilities are constrained. So when they did, because they had to live up to their responsibilities of providing water in the household, they would then face increased forms of violence as a result of just not knowing what to do. If I don't have enough at home, and the men are going to be frustrated with me for that, but I need to go out and figure it out. But if I go out, then my you know, I'm threatened in terms of sexual harassment, but my purity and living up to those standards is also threatened. So those sorts of links started to emerge, but we would never have understood those links if it wasn't for I hate that word empowering, but basically giving a full-time salary to research assistants from the places who understood the languages, who could build meaningful, trusting relationships and document over time, and then it shifting into a place where those relationships were genuinely participatory and the people we were working with were generating the content themselves. So this was with 2,500 people over 3 years, and that project has really lived on for many years afterwards because it feels relatively quite embedded. So what we next did was then we, you know, started doing other projects which were on climate responses. So we said, hey, you know, now the country is starting to recognize it's one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, and it's also one of the poorest when it comes to responding. But there's no consultation, particularly not with the women's movement, despite there being a very strong and brilliant women's movement. So they've started developing these kind of investment pathways, and one of them is with the Chinese government, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and lots of people are concerned about how that's going to play out. So part of the responses are these mega projects, and this is where we get to the imagining development in the context of Pakistan and in many other places. You know, governments feel it's within their remit to imagine what the future should be, and in Pakistan there's lots of envisioning of we're going to make Karachi the new Dubai. You know, we're going to, and people who are living in the cities, you know, in the context of Karachi, that's 60% of people are living in informal settlements. Kachiyabadis actually is what they're called. And that's not, you know, that's not in their vision. Let's find out what their vision is, because, you know, maybe they don't want fancy malls or, you know, like infrastructure they'll never actually get to access in big gated developments. Maybe they want something else. So you know, we started working with communities impacted by these mega projects on climate responses. So big solar parks, water, kind of, you know, renewables work to understand the gendered impacts and the displacement impacts, but also specifically dispossession of livelihoods. And there were some quite systemic issues around that. So we worked with the same research assistants that we worked with before, but we also opened up, you know, recruitment for others from the region. So it really felt like a genuine partnership, and it still does. And just, okay, so I can talk about that forever in terms of what the impacts are, but in terms of sort of the knowledge generation, what I found very interesting, but also really problematic and challenging in my position was that the Northern institutions that I've worked with, they say they want partnership and equality, equity and participation, but in reality, when you have someone like me who's saying 90% of the money of this project needs to go to that institution in Pakistan, or 90% needs to go to that institution in Jordan, there's so many like, wait, what do you mean? You know, there's this very much this mentality of we can do partnership by a little bit of a tag-on fund. And that isn't how it works, and it's not how I want to work. And if we're going to invest in supporting knowledge generation around development and climate issues, we need to do it in a way where the money goes where the money needs to be, basically. But I face that challenge all the time, and it's really, you know, it's disheartening for me, but imagine how it must be for those people who are actually the ones who really drive the knowledge, who have the expertise, and who just don't get heard enough. And I notice that all the time, that, you know, I face barriers as a woman of colour in the climate space. So I'm an IPCC contributing author. So that's basically the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's like we look at the evidence where it is, it's scientists across the world. But I get talked down to all the time by, you know, usually white men, you know, mansplaining the evidence to me. And I know they've never even read the evidence at the extent I have. And I'm constantly having to justify my position, and it's very frustrating. So, you know, I'm just constantly thinking about what it must be like for feminists, you know, Southern feminists, having to deal with that. And another trend that I've seen that's really worrying is that where there's really interesting work going on, institutions like the World Bank start trying to get in there. So one institution that I'm closely involved with that has started, you know, living a life of its own, getting research funds on its own, doesn't need people like me to channel it, because people are seeing, wow, there's this amazing talent there that we haven't, you know, we've underinvested in. But then, you know, that we had an instance recently with one institution where the World Bank wanted to get in and effectively take over that institution so that it could be seen as a knowledge generator for that region. And that's something we had to resist. And so, you know, like, I think working together as Southerners and Northerners to resist those kinds of things is something that's really important. So yeah, for me, in terms of the new social contract and moving forward, I mean, I'm just trying to galvanize people like me sitting here with the privileges that we have to look at things a different way, but it's really, really challenging. And there's just so much unconscious bias, and I'm sure I have it myself. And, you know, we have to kind of meter out our own kind of tendencies to being colonial in the work that we do. So sorry that was more about process than outcome, but I'm happy to share any of the work that I've been involved in over email or just reach out. Thanks.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you. Process is important. Process is how we get to a point. So, and that's often where we go wrong. So please don't apologize for that. If you can give us more explanations about process, we are very happy to have more of that knowledge and understanding. It really is in terms of the journey and the journey forward. Thank you for all those points. Thank you for your solidarity. That's what you've. I think that's what we can call it, and bringing up issues of this word allyship, which is, you know, all kinds of things. But you know, how do we the spectrum that goes from white saviorism to true solidarity and working with people to help. Again, I'm going to use this term because that's going to be my word for the day, to really realize people's rights to self-determination in terms of them having decision-making power over their own lives. The question of water, I think we need to come back to again and again and again. The story of water provision to households and the burden it's putting on women. And we saw this in the COVID crisis, because even here in Zimbabwe, we don't have running water in most households. Officially, we do. The taps are there. The water doesn't come out of them, right? And so, you know, women, young girls were having to queue at boreholes to get water. But because of the lockdown measures, it became very violent, exploitative, almost a whole mafia type system developing around it, where in fact the sort of sexual harassment that was happening around that was pretty bad. But then you talk about investment in mega projects. I think we can look at many of the infrastructure projects, our roads, So the masculinization of development is something that we need to talk about. So roads, transport, whatever. But if you look at the investment into water and sanitation, it's zero. And I was even shocked myself when I was, doing some work around it. And I was like, how is water and sanitation not one of the primary, and it cannot be delivered privately. It can't be delivered privately. So, these are all really important points. And then the question of knowledge, I'm going to come back to that because I'll talk too much. And I know we have another speaker who we need to bring on. I think it's going to be, is it Fatima? Yes. Now I said I couldn't moderate and now I'm talking too much. So Fatima, are you there?
Hello.
Hi,
Yes,
hi,
I'm here.
hi. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for being here. It's a little bit earlier where you are than where we are.
Yeah.
But hey, feminism is a 24-hour job.
Absolutely.
Please, can you introduce yourself and then give us your contributions? Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're very welcome. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Yes, it's early where I am. I'm also in the UK with Amira, so I'm sure we've both got our caffeine hits alongside us to try and get through it. But it's okay. It's not that late. It's only 7:45 right now, so it's already well into the morning. So a quick introduction to who I am. I describe myself as a Pan-African feminist. I work in the fields of research, strategic advice, technical advice across various areas. I work primarily at the macroeconomic level these days, but I've worked in the education sector, the health sector, and the women's economic rights and justice sector more recently. I've been in this field for about 20 years now, and the struggle has not lessened in that time. It has actually become more complex. It has become more traumatic in some ways, unfortunately. So there is no rest, alas, and we must keep going. And today, actually, I'm going to speak a little bit on a slightly different kind of angle with this. So because I work primarily at the macroeconomic level, I'm going to center my presentation in that space. And in particular, I want to look at the idea of, or I want to explore the intersections between climate justice and the idea of a social contract that we have within a macroeconomic policy paradigm in the agricultural sector in particular. So basically, this looks at how the continued push for agricultural industrial expansion as a dominant macroeconomic policy paradigm intersects with climate justice or climate injustices in particular, and what that has, what the impact that has on our food systems and our longer term well-being in particular, and there are care ramifications that come from that. And why this is inherently a Southern feminist issue. Despite the projection that agriculture will contract as a sector globally, even in a continent like Africa, which is still has what's considered an underdeveloped, and I use in quote, air quotes here, an underdeveloped sector, because the service sector is growing so rapidly, it will contract as a contributor to gross domestic product, so to GDP. But again, here you see the problem in that statistical analysis, because gross domestic product is used as the measurement, which is problematic in and of itself, because then we see what we're doing here is worshipping again at the temple of growth as an indicator for our development. And, and as I'm sure has been discussed probably in several seminars within this wonderful festival, this is something that we must, as feminists, turn away from and challenge vehemently. So I'll just give a bit of a background, first of all, to the agro-industrial expansion sort of paradigm. It's premised on the idea of the Green Revolution. So this is a move from smallholder farming to large commercialized farming. And this involves the consolidation of land into fewer and fewer hands, which is a nice way of actually describing, land theft, land grabs, and, a variety of other, complicated but yet still legal ways of removing ownership of land from the wider population, and also undermining the idea of land as commons and the fruits of that land as commons. Now, this also involves the ascendancy of cash cropping and monocropping, so fewer and fewer crops being farmed, and for the market specifically. So then, food becomes at the mercy of market fluctuations and vagaries. So your engagement with food becomes a dollar transaction even more. And the Green Revolution has gained ascendancy in particular since 2008 after the global food crisis, because it became wedded to the food security agenda as a global policy driver. So in Africa, we have the Alliance for the Green Revolution, Africa AGRA, which pretty much dominates all agricultural policy. And if you try to come away from that as a country, you try to explore anything else, you'll be seen as an outlier. What's important to understand is, to a certain extent, and I would argue, that food security has been sold to us as being part of a wider social contract. And this is where we start to have quite a problematic kind of engagement with it, because it's premised on the idea that it will solve hunger across the world, and it will be a sustainable mechanism for guaranteeing better human health indicators. But the problem is, food security has not solved hunger, and even though it has overproduced food, which has led to waste and dumping, facilitated by trade liberalization deals that leave developing countries in particular open to an influx of cheap foods, which undermines their local food systems. Now, the climate justice implications of this, if we look, the Green Revolution has essentially occurred across the global north. It's taken, several hundreds of years to happen. And across much of Asia also, it's well underway. And that's been a more rapid process over the last 50 years or so. But what are the ecological impacts of this? So the FAO at the beginning of the 21st century released a report that they have yet to rescind. And so I will continue to use the statistic that 75% of crop diversity, 75% of crop biodiversity was lost in the 20th century alone. And Europe and Central Asia have seen about a 42% loss in decrease in their terrestrial animal and plant species in terms of population size, mainly as due to intensive agricultural production and forestry practices. There's some evidence to suggest that in India, before the Green Revolution kicked in the 1970s, there were thousands of varieties of rice being consumed, widely, and now within decades, this has dropped to double digits. So, what we see is more natural resources being consumed, but ultimately, less being produced that are needed and getting to people more widely. So, why is this a feminist issue, and what is the role of women within this? So fundamentally, women are at the coalface of these devastating transitions. We can't really underplay that. They are the custodians of indigenous, diverse seeds, which are in direct conflict with the very idea of the Green Revolution and the monocropping and cash cropping that comes with that. And this is one of the reasons why cash cropping is so heavily masculinized. But, we also know there are power relationships there. So even in areas where women may be the natural custodians of what becomes a cash crops, like was the case with bananas in East Africa, often what will happen is the moment that becomes a market crop, men will come in and actually, essentially take over that market. But critically, women's farming practices are also more climate resilient. Knowledge systems that we've had for hundreds of years are able to weather droughts and pests, because the more diverse your farming actually is, the more likely you are able to get through those challenges that come with variations in weather. And border cropping is just a classic example, where you will actually protect various key crops by planting various crops around the edges of your farms, is known as a climate resilient practice. It's known as a good agricultural practice. And so when we strip away this, the power that women have in this space, we are exposing them even more so to the devastations of climate change. And with that comes some of what has already been discussed already. Amira, spoke about this, the crisis over water, food, but also we're talking about forced migration on the back of these impacts. And at the household women level, women's power is decreased also as their roles within the agricultural space is further undermined. And so when you see women having to lose plots of land to commercialized, mechanized, industrialized agriculture, you will see that whatever kind of roles or power balances that they may have had at the community or household level are essentially also being stripped away. Now, one of the reasons, that's one aspect of it. But another reason why this is quite critical is because, women are central to domestic and local food production and food systems more generally. And their crops are what essentially ensure varied and nutritional diets. Now, I don't want to over essentialize women's role within this, because obviously there's a problem in that in and of itself. The relationship between women, the burden of care, food production is very well noted. But I think what we need to also understand is, again, this comes back to the issue of knowledge. The loss of women's knowledge in this spaces is fundamentally detrimental, both to women themselves, but to the communities more widely, and actually undermines the very idea of the social contract that food security is presenting to us globally and nationally, that it will somehow take care of our needs. And more broadly, there's actually an inherent conflict between the promise of food security and better health outcomes. And the reason for this is because we have seen in nearly all countries that have had a green revolution, we have seen a rise in non-communicable diseases. And in Africa, we have projections of quite significant rises in non-communicable diseases. And women will have higher percentages of that in the next 10 years as food becomes over-refined and over-processed and more essentially less localized. So despite this, this evidence that suggests that food security is problematic, we still see a huge commitment to it in so many ways. The Director General, the former Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, Jose Graziano da Silva, actually called this the Cathedral of the Green Revolution. And, that use of religious terminology is not wrong, because it underpins the risks an individual faces when challenging that paradigm, or even a country more broadly. And food sovereignty is what the Food and Agriculture Organization has actually been promoting more. Now, one of the reasons why I would argue this is a far better social contract that needs to be pursued at the macroeconomic policy level is because it places communities and people at the heart of food, insisting on the autonomy of those producing the food, the farmers, and those consuming the food. And it makes the decision-making power and ownership of those processes inherently at the community level. And agroecological practices are a part of that food sovereignty movement, and actually challenge the agro-industrial commercialized nature that has become prominent. And the FAO has actually tried to promote this. So Senegal is a classic country that is exploring agroecology as a policy paradigm in and of itself. But the question is, as AGRA and the various dominant orthodoxies that continue to push commercialized agriculture continue, how can one country, or even two or three, on a continent like Africa be able to withstand the challenges that come, particularly when you have increased trade liberalization with the continent, the challenges that come with dumping and excessive exportation and importation into their countries of food. Now, I think it's important to note that women are at the heart of agroecological and food sovereignty movements, pushing for greater control, their role in the agricultural future of their countries. But it's also important to understand that through that, we have a greater centering of autonomy and control over what we do with our bodies. And in many ways, this is what it actually comes back down to. So I'm just going to, sort of roll call a couple of names to end here. Mariama Sonko of We Are the Solution in Senegal, Leonida Odongo in Uganda. These are women who are leading some of these charges. And actually, you will find women's agroecological collectives across the continent and across the world more broadly. So the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa has got multiple women's agroecological bodies within it working there. And I will end there and leave any questions, because I feel I've gone over time a little bit, and leave any questions to come on the back of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you so much. Yeah, food sovereignty is a South feminist issue for sure. Thank you so much for raising the question of the narratives about, food security and, sort of the image that has been given, and the lie behind it, the Green Revolution and the consolidation of land into fewer and fewer hands. Where have we heard that before? And the current agricultural models that are being promoted under the guise of food security as the social contract. The lack of policy space, I think we're calling it, around what you choose as your agriculture / food sovereignty model. So we have not only is the agriculture becoming more and more monocropping, but the template type of policy making on this is what it has to be, and we call it food security. And then the gender questions around that. And again, I think that things like food and the way it's gendered, that when it becomes an issue for capitalism, it's a male thing. When it comes for who's going to get fed, it's female. And the question of how that is being done and the gendered imbalances around that are really key. So I can't summarize it all. I'm so glad we have a recording of all of these, because we're going to go through them and share them and offer these as opportunities for us to think through what it is we want to talk about the way forward. And this puts the questions of food sovereignty really squarely on the agenda for us. So thank you for that. So I'm going to now move to Nilanjana is coming next with more, and then it's we have about 30 minutes of this session left, so we do have time. I know people, Amira and Fatima and Rachel were apologizing about the time taken. I think we're good on that. So Nilanjana, that's not to encourage you to go overboard, but please.
You know me too well.
Please go ahead, and then we'll have whatever comments are coming up. I'll read through those. And
okay,
great, thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thanks, Nancy. I just want to sort of it really resonates what Fatima has shared with us. We are in India. There have been sort of 3 farm bills that have been passed as reforms. And there's a massive protest by farmers. I think it looks like this fascist regime is sort of, meeting its match. And the farm bills are being presented as removing middlemen between farmers and the market, and the middleman is the state. And that's what neoliberalism is, which is to remove the state from intervening or speaking on behalf of citizens and workers. So it really resonates what Fatima said. So I'm going to sort of quickly go back to the theme of reimagining development, which is the theme for today. And I think the first thing to say is that the reimagination has already happened, and it's the neoliberal reimagining of development. And it hasn't just been a reimagining, but a ruthless, relentless, militaristic, in collusion with fascism earlier and now, rolling out of this reimagination of development across Latin America in the 70s, Asia and Africa in the 80s. And this reimagination not only recolonized, occupied, and erased national sovereign policy, legislative, and regulatory spaces in countries across the global south. It erased via an apartheidist global financial and multilateral spaces all third world South internationalist projects, such as the Right to Development, and more importantly, from the 1970s, the new international economic order, which was, a set of proposals made by developing countries through UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to promote their own interests, improving their terms of trade, increasing development assistance, and in the broader sort of vision of a visioning of the international economic system in favor of the third world countries, and the replacing of the Bretton Woods systems, which had benefited and continues to benefit the leading states that had created it, especially the United States. So I think we have to sort of, think about the reimagination. Neoliberalism was the reimagination of development, especially from a sort of, global South perspective. Coming to the question of, the social reproduction and care. We have seen the revival of, the feminist concepts of care and social reproduction recently. I think it was the middle of the last decade through the UN human rights system, and Rachel, who had been following this as well, can correct me if I'm wrong. When the former sort of UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Magdalena Sepulveda's report came out. But even as this mainstreaming of the notion of the concept of care, not so much social reproduction, the mainstreaming started happening, the appropriation started happening as well, and the IMF and the World Bank, suddenly started talking about women's unpaid care work, and that sort of, we know that kind of linguistic kleptomania from the IMF has existed as long as they have existed. So it was women's rights to save neoliberalism. Even the attention to care, it was from the lens of using women's rights and feminist concerns to save neoliberalism, even as they pushed more and more austerity, which meant more unpaid labor, women's unpaid labor to subsidize the state and capital, and more women in sweatshops because they used this and continue to do so under the garb of increasing female labor force participation, more and more women indebted, through entrepreneurship, the promotion of entrepreneurship rather than women's rights, and through financial inclusion as solutions, which we know are false solutions. And this is not just a question of sort of appropriation of language, even though that itself is important in and of itself. This is about sort of emptying out of feminism, emptying feminism of its content, of its politics, and feminist struggles of their transformative energy. So it is something that we have to push, and we, of course, as feminists, especially Southern feminists, have sort of pushed back against this. And I think all of the sort of people on this panel and other panels have through their collective work sort of pushed back on this. And we need to continue to push back on this, because there is a very worrying sort of, and it's not just the IMF and the World Bank now, Melinda Gates is regularly talking about women's unpaid care and sort of investing in work around women's unpaid care work. And we have to push back on it as Southern feminists, feminists from the South, because there is a sort of there is a partnership between northern feminists in the North with this notion of using the language of unpaid care without wittingly or unwittingly, and solely focusing on female labor force participation, which is more and more women in more and more precarious work. And it is the question around sort of shared responsibility rather than looking at investments, and a social contract between the state and the people in its jurisdiction, and not just citizens. So we have to continuously sort of push back on this. The third sort of point, and I wouldn't go over time because I would love to hear from participants here. The third point is there is more and more conversation around social reproduction now in sort of progressive and even left sort of circles, and which is of course fantastic, which is great, even in the conversations around the global Green New Deal. Whatever that means, I think we, as Southern feminists, we have to really engage with the conversations on the global Green New Deal, what that means, and we are going to have a plenary session on that. What that means, and what does a Green New Deal, whether we even use the language of a New Deal, what does that look like from a sort of South feminist perspective? But I digress. So I think it's also worrying that the conversations in these left and progressive circles around social reproduction, even if they rightly focus not only on sort of domestic work, unpaid care and domestic work, they focus on social reproduction as institutions, as infrastructure. So, public transport, public housing, water and sanitation infrastructure, public spaces, and focus on these institutions and infrastructure. What is worrying is if we follow those conversations, is that it almost seems like because feminists have sort of foregrounded social reproduction in the last couple of months, last couple of years. There is this sort of need to sort of talk about social reproduction, but simultaneously sort of evicting women and women's labor from the question around social reproduction. So looking at so you have I think we have attended a few conversations in left circles where and sort of male-dominated left circles where there is a conversation about social reproduction and the institutions of social reproduction, right? Public health, public education, public housing, etc., without a conversation about women's paid and unpaid labor. So this is another sort of and as we move forward, this is another sort of really important conversation that we need to, as South feminists, need to engage with, have conversations amongst ourselves about, write about it, envision what social reproduction, before it gets emptied out of feminism and feminists and severed from feminists and our struggles, have a conversation about that and envision what that looks like. In terms of an anti-capitalist agenda, because social reproduction is fundamentally anti-capitalist, and those who are anti-capitalist but not feminists refuse to recognize social reproduction. So this is something that we need to have a conversation about and need to sort of write about. I'm going to stop there. Sorry, I've sort of gone over sort of, being a wee bit wordy, but yeah, I wanted to sort of put those 3 points out there and would love some conversation around them.
Thank you very much, Nilangela. Thank you. More about the sort of, I think where Amira started talking about the World Bank and the World Bank particularly, but also the IMF, the sort of capturing and appropriation not only of knowledge but also of language, and they really understand that these are how you shape directions. Is that if when new language comes up that might give people ideas, they need to capture that and redefine the meaning to neoliberalize and depoliticize that. And Priyanti also highlighted that in her comment, Thank you for highlighting the challenges around decolonizing research and knowledge. Both the white savior complex and the white superiority of knowledge are truly constraints to the South setting its own agendas for development. Absolutely. I think one of the things that this festival is showing is that it is not knowledge that is lacking at all. Certainly not from the side of women. And so we are quite capable of coming up with our own policy solutions. We have the necessary knowledge for that. So these are the complex points. Nilangela's point about neoliberalism having reimagined its own form of development for us, and the need for us also to interrogate the global Green New Deal, and questions around the agenda around social production and keeping it as a feminist and South feminist question, rather than as it gets mainstreamed and male-streamed, it sort of becomes a social reproduction without women and forgetting women's labor. So thank you very much for those points. Lebohang had a couple of points in the chat. I'm going to ask, I'll ask just now to say maybe we can, if you're ready, maybe we can give you the mic for a couple of minutes, but you don't have to do that now. I'll go back to our panelists and ask if there are a couple of thoughts around that, because we don't have so many questions. So maybe you could add some more points. And then I'll ask Lebohang to just speak also to the points she's raised. My voice is not necessarily the best one to read them out. I'm sure she can do it quite well on her own. Amira, Fatima, Rachel, would you like to add any points here?
I mean, I can just say something about climate smart agriculture.
Yes, thank you.
I really, both of those questions / comments are just so, yeah, insightful and really resonate. I don't know if I can answer in full, but what I do know is, as with, the development project, I've sat in the organizations who've created some of these brands and these names, and oh, my video isn't on, my apologies. And it does feel that they're sort of a label which obscures the same practices, the same forms of reproduction of power fundamentally in different ways. So, I mean, climate smart agriculture has been challenged. I believe ActionAid has written a piece just challenging it and basically saying it's a catch-all phrase for what can therefore be anything. And very much like how the neoliberal project works, it's the same with water, right? When I was doing my PhD, I was looking at all the different phrases and languages and narratives that were being used to kind of a new idea like local ownership. We'll have local ownership of water, but then you look at it and it's basically some form of privatization, that doesn't reach the people who need it the most. And, just so my concern is it's like these labels which obscure the same practices over and over again. And I think that we're going to face that in an extreme way when it comes to responding to the climate crisis, because, given the urgency of responding and how late we are, and now suddenly people are catching on in all sorts of power circles, right? And there's a sort of demand on them to act. I'm really concerned about some of the things that are going to be pushed through extremely fast over the next few years. And those changes need to happen, but who is making the decisions over those changes and how they're being implemented? And, as with the mega projects, from my experience working on the climate technical space, what you need is micro projects at scale. So the example of agroecology is perfect that Fatima was talking about, because when you look at agroecology, obviously every single implementation of it is not going to be the same, but on balance, you tend to see that it increases soil health. You tend to see it reduces women's unpaid care burden. You start to see that young girls who are pulled out of school, because of the impacts of climate and poor agricultural methods on soil health, they're going back to school because the time needed for farming is going down, right? So if you do that at scale, that can have a huge impact on the resilience of a country, but also individuals, households, and so on. But that's not what we're seeing at the moment. What we're seeing is these mega projects which have so many potential risks, and due to poor kind of national laws around environmental and social impact assessments, those processes are not capturing the risks in full, or they're capturing them and then putting them in a box and hiding them somewhere. So this is my real concern. And I think, you know, it's on many of us to just keep an eye on what's going on and call out and just make it hard. That's what I see my role as a lot of the time, just make it hard for those notions and labels to go unchallenged, make it more inconvenient so that they just start thinking, okay, we're not going to bother with this. That's what I hope, but sorry that I couldn't answer it in more technically, but thank you.
So much. Fatima, did you want to comment as well?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Amira. I think Amira has actually broken down the issue around climate smart agriculture really well. And I think both of Lebahang's questions are obviously fantastic. And I think to a large extent, the one regarding climate smart agriculture, in the framing of the question, the answer is also there in terms of what the problem is and why we need to resist it. And I think the first thing to do is just to re-emphasize the point that Amira has already made regarding what is the appropriation of, what are actually climate resilient, indigenous knowledge systems, etc., and how the language and narrative around that is picked up and used by mainstream agricultural practices such as CSA, climate smart agriculture, and how that's then rolled out in massive agricultural programming and policy spaces. And it's all very much a lip service. So we talk about pinkwashing, this is greenwashing to a certain extent. And it's awful because what you also have is a tie-in of, the corporate dominance around this. And earlier in the week, Lebahang moderated a really great session that I was very lucky to be part of that looked at corporate power. And so what you will also see is how that narrative is being picked up by corporations that dominate the agricultural space and who are, I would argue, fundamentally responsible for the push of this green revolution paradigm. Seed companies that are producing hybrid seeds, right, which undermines seed sovereignty, undermines women's seed sovereignty in particular, and undermines knowledge systems that are being presented as climate resilient, right? The fact that you are tied into these seeds because, these hybrid seeds are not repeatable, so they cannot be replanted, that you lose all autonomy over them, that the intellectual property that even went into the building of them is stripped away from communities, all of that is gone. And then you'll see this packaging and this narrative by the corporations in terms of how this is responding to the climate crisis, as part of their framing. And we do really need to be there to call this out because, speaking of this specifically from an African perspective and seeing where the continent is being taken over the next 10 to 20 years in particular, and very rapidly, as Amira has pointed out, it's going to happen very rapidly. The extent to which our policymakers are aware or not aware of how serious this is a question that I ask myself every day. On the one hand, I think, is it blind ignorance or is it, knowing, there's a knowing there, but just a complete, refusal to acknowledge the problem. So we have to call it out consistently, and we have to show the way in which transnational capital, as Lebahang has pointed out, is pushing agendas that actually have nothing to do with the people of the African continent. And these corporations are extra continental corporations. So these are corporations that are based and from the global north primarily. And I think very critically, just as a last point, I think it's really important, and I say this as a Nigerian and a Brit, because that is my position. I always point out that when we look at the global north, the ideal of development that so many of our countries are trying to copy is horrendously flawed. There is poverty in countries with enormous amounts of wealth. There is hunger, there is deprivation, there is disease, there is poor nutrition, all of these things. But just because there are working traffic lights or running water or other indicators that we consider to be developed does not mean that this is the end game. this idea of visioning something different is to be brave enough to say we do not have to copy that same development paradigm. And I think this is really the conversation that we need to have. We don't have to copy it. The problems in the global north are not where we want to be in 2050 as global southern countries.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Fatima had a clock behind on the wall, and it was really great for timekeeping. Now she switched off her video. Rachel, and it's exactly right, you know. Rachel, what I'm going to do is because we have the 10 minutes, you will be the one to close up. So I'll ask Lebohang if she's there. She had a couple of points to come in, and then you will be the last word for this session. I've also I've put it in the chat. Next week, the Global South Women's Forum is happening. It's on disrupting macroeconomics. The conversation will continue, and many of these points I think will be built on, expanded upon questions of the IFIs, questions around privatization. I want to just plug another one of those terms that has traveled and gained popularity: financial inclusion. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear. And it's been rolled up, and we've been workshopped through it and critiquing where these terms come from, like who came up with this term and what does it mean in reality. It really has to be something that we do across. And women are targeted for these terms as well, because, you know, they have nice climate resilience. Who doesn't want that, you know? And so they know how community health is now going to become a problem post-COVID, because we know what that means when they say it. So anyways, I'm just gonna have that's my little rant. Lebohang, please, a couple of minutes to just make the points that you had put in the Q&A.
No, actually, I think Fatima already answered. I feel like I've already been answered, but I guess just to reiterate, especially the second point around this search and rescue humanitarian interventionist style of international development, which isn't really development, and whether or not we've found the vocabulary yet, especially in the global South and as Black and brown women, to resist that, particularly because there's a blurring of military and humanitarian agendas, which is really eroding kind of this notion of neutrality of aid workers and this so-called neutrality of development work, and that, you know, it does lie within a a new colonial development construct, and it's an ongoing being my bonnet, and I don't actually expect an answer right now and here, but I do think that we have to completely dismantle, disavow, and find ways to work parallel to, you know, this kind of fake internationalism, which is really steeped in an imperial imagination. I just don't know what that looks like. Thanks.
There was a comment about this is not blind ignorance from Saradzai. I think the gatekeepers of neoliberalism, neocolonialism, and capitalism are deliberately complicit because they benefit and do not care about the masses. Complicity, collusion, capitulation. I don't think we're really seeing the state taking responsibility, the responsibilities it's supposed to be taking in terms of its the promises of decolonization. So it's really important for us to also go back to that question of the post-colonial state and the way it's come apart in so many terrible ways, and the way it's the disappointments of those states. Maybe it was predictable, we should have known. But I'm going to ask Rachel to wrap up, and then we'll have our two performances after this, so we can switch off our cameras at the end and really enjoy the performances that are going to come from our two artists, excuse me for momentarily forgetting names. Rachel, round this up for us, please. as only you can.
What an easy task. I'm actually not going to try to do that, but I wanted to add, I just wanted to add that, you know, the fallout of these multiple crises and these policies, be it ecological, climate smart, all of these, the fallout of the sort of the ecological and care crisis is being dealt with, or is being imagined as something that can be dealt with through social protection. And I want to put that forward as something that we haven't talked about in this space, but that is so critical to how we imagine a social contract. Because in speaking to the bank, what they were saying about social protection coming out of COVID was that this is a way for financial inclusion, for registering people, for mobile banking. And also it acts as a safety net so that we don't have to change policies today, but when the next crisis comes, everyone's registered and everyone can get those $2 extra to help them through the next crisis. And that's a really dangerous narrative that's emerging out of COVID, but that it also presents challenges in terms of the fallout of these future crises. And we know there will be future interrelated, interdependent crises coming. And so where do we situate the role of social protection and expand that beyond, as Southern feminists, beyond sort of the breadwinner model that has been so dominant in the global north, and how do we reimagine that for our societies? As Fatima was saying, we don't have to reproduce these models in the global north. They haven't worked. They haven't worked in terms of social protection. And what's on the table right now in terms of how to mitigate these crises are so limited, so unimaginative. And I think that's sort of another point just to bring to the debate, rather than trying to summarize what has been a really rich and engaging discussion. I wasn't going to do it.
You know, I'm very good at delegating my moderating task.
I know.
But thank you for raising that. It's really important, because it is seen as sort of in the reimagining development question. Social protection is really one of these very big things, and again, it's the way it comes in and the way it's being deployed to sort of allow neoliberalism to continue with people not asking too many questions is like let's talk about social protection while the rest continues. So I would like to just say thank you to our panelists. There is so much. We need more time. We need more thinking, but the idea about all of this is to help us also as South Feminist Futures think through what is it that we need to talk about around these themes. We've had the inputs. I wanted to even just say, even all through this week, or even in planning this this festival, there's so many, it was quite hard. You know, you've got so many brilliant feminists across, you don't know where to choose, you don't know how to approach it. And we could run this festival next week with completely different faces. It would be absolutely as brilliant, because we know we have the knowledge, we just need to bring it together and work together in terms of our agenda. So thank you to you, and thank you to everyone at the end of the week. I just wanted to say that because today is our last day. So we have our two artists, Stephanie Mwamba, who from the DRC, she is bringing her second piece in. She's joined the call, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the second piece, but that beautiful dance piece that we had at the beginning, she's going to have a second one. And then I'm going to switch to French. Nous avons Lynn Demont qui va aussi nous présenter une pièce. J'ai eu l'occasion de parler avec elle hier, donc ce sera très bien de la voir. Et merci toutes les deux pour nous rejoindre. We're really looking forward to your performance. Stephanie, we'd like to hear a little bit more about your beautiful dance work and introduce yourself.
Bonjour, hello. Je veux pouvoir parler en français. Moi, c'est Stéphanie Mamba. Je suis artiste danseuse congolaise basée à Goma. Et la performance que je vous ai présentée, ça s'appelle Uhuru. In French, ça veut dire liberté. Et
Hi, we've had I think.
Et la liberté, j'essaie un peu de parler de la femme congolaise et gomatracienne à travers... Hello.
Hello, Stéphanie, ça coupe un petit peu?
Oui. Je ne sais pas si vous me captez.
Oui, maintenant ça marche.
Ah, d'accord. Donc, je disais la performance Uhuru, la pièce que je fais, c'est en français. Cette pièce, elle veut juste mettre en valeur les femmes artistes de mon pays. Et si j'ai choisi l'endroit où il y a un robot roulage, et si vous voyez bien, c'est inscrit Women's Technology. Ça aussi, je voulais juste présenter la valeur de la femme qui a fait ça, pour juste dire que les femmes aussi, elles peuvent faire quelque chose de mieux pour faire aussi avancer la région, le pays et pourquoi pas le continent. Donc, c'est un peu ça. Ma performance, elle veut mettre en valeur toutes ces femmes qui font des choses, mais parfois ça passe inaperçu par faute de moyens ou par de stigmatisation souvent qu'on retrouve dans la communauté, dans nos familles, dans les églises. C'est un peu ça. Donc, c'est un combat qu'on essaie de mener tout le jour et tout le temps à travers nos activités artistiques qu'on essaie de faire.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Stéphanie. Je pense qu'on peut mettre la pièce. Sorry,
Oui.
We're going to start screening the piece. Which part of, where in DRC are you, by the way? It's a big country. Vous êtes où en RDC?
Je suis précisément dans la ville de Goma. À Goma, au Nord Kivu.
D'accord,
oui.
d'accord. Merci,
ouais.
Merci. OK.
Stupid.
Wow, thank you. Oh, wow, our hearts. Thank you so much. It's a really, really beautiful piece. Absolutely. Oh, wow. Merci, merci beaucoup. On vient, j'espère qu'on va pouvoir voyager à Goma pour voir encore plus de performances comme ça. Vraiment, c'est super joli. Merci. Je vais continuer en français parce que je pense que normalement, on devait avoir l'une des mots qui allait nous rejoindre elle est de Côte d'Ivoire. Elle allait nous rejoindre pour présenter sa pièce. Mais elle n'est pas, je pense qu'on n'a pas pu la voir. Peut-être elle a eu des problèmes pour se connecter. On a quand même la pièce. Donc, c'est l'une des mots de Côte d'Ivoire. Ça, c'est la deuxième pièce. Voilà, aujourd'hui, on a beaucoup de chance avec les artistes. Merci beaucoup. On a trois pièces. Normalement, c'est une, mais on a de la chance aujourd'hui parce qu'on a un peu plus de temps. Letu. Je pense qu'on peut monter la pièce pour le voir.
Être visionnaire, ce n'est pas voir l'avenir. Le pouvoir se trouve dans le savoir. Le savoir s'acquiert à travers une vision. La vision vraie n'existe que dans l'amour. Notre regard sur le passé définit souvent notre vision du futur. Et comme le plus important, c'est le présent, alors ensemble, faisons refleurir dans nos cœurs un pan de notre histoire, l'histoire de ces femmes qui ont touché le ciel. Elles ont marché dans la sueur et le sang pour réclamer la dignité de leur rang. Elles ont refusé de courber l'échine, solidaires et volontaires, le cœur recouvert d'épines. Elles ont survécu à l'asservissement, prôné sans vergogne par un patriarcat exacerbé. Le monde ne leur a pas fait cadeau de la tristement immortelle aventure avec la pomme. Mais un jour, elles ont dit non. Elles ont brandi leur bâton de pèlerin. Elles ont levé l'étendard de la dignité. Elles ont arboré la couronne qui les divinise et elles ont crié féminisme aux 4 coins du monde, féminisme dans les foyers pour les femmes, féminisme dans la société pour l'égalité des droits, féminisme partout où a subsisté une inégalité entre hommes et femmes. Elles ont crié féminisme. D'hier à aujourd'hui, l'Afrique a conçu dans sa matrice des femmes de pouvoir. Et sur les sentiers de la lutte, l'encre de nos rêves n'a pas coulé en vain. Elles sont des reines, elles sont des mères. Elles sont des femmes, elles sont des flammes, et elles ont brûlé pour qu'advienne une nouvelle ère. Les héroïnes des premières heures. Avec des lettres de sang, elles ont inscrit leur nom en blanc dans l'histoire de mon Afrique noire. Par leur marque indélébile, elles ont ancré dans le cœur des générations à venir le goût de la liberté. Les héroïnes des premières heures. Elles ont sacrifié un enfant pour que vive le peuple. Elles ont combattu en guerrières pour l'intégrité. Elles ont régné en maîtres pour faire prospérer les États. L'histoire le tait, les femmes l'ont fait, ce que vos cœurs oublient, les mots le crient. Elles mettent au monde des enfants, ces hommes. Les éduquent avec amour, oui, elles sont bonnes, même si elles savent qu'ils iront un jour légitimer le monopole du pouvoir. Elles ont souvent grandi sans instruction, mais malgré tout gravi les échelons, bâti les empires et conquis la vie. Elles sont romancières, artistes. Elles sont pilotes, elles sont avocates. Elles sont cultivatrices, directrices. Elles sont ménagères, présidentes. Elles sont poétesses, slameuses. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne. Avec des lettres de sang, elles ont inscrit leur nom en blanc dans l'histoire de mon Afrique noire. Par leur marque indélébile, elles ont ancré dans le cœur des générations à venir le goût de la liberté. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne. Elles s'appellent Marie Raji. Elles s'appellent Marie Corée. Elles ont marché contre un néocolonialisme exacerbé dans une société patriarcale implacable. Elle s'appelle Abla Poku, elle s'appelle Anzinga, elle s'appelle Tansi Yangbe, elle s'appelle Yenenga. Elles ont tenu fermement les rênes du pouvoir. Le pouvoir, un étalon sauvage qui piétine tant de vie. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne. Elle s'appelle Winnie Mandela. Je la vois debout dans la cité arc-en-ciel pour réclamer l'égalité des couleurs. Elle s'appelle Gidi Wanja. Elle nous a démontré avec maestria que les mathématiques, c'est pas magique. Elle s'appelle Myriam Makeba. Elle s'appelle Angélique Kidjo. Elles ont conquis le monde debout sur un micro. Peut-être qu'un jour on dira l'île des mots. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne. Avec des lettres de sang, elles ont inscrit leur nom en blanc dans l'histoire de mon Afrique noire. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne. Je pense à Sarah Ounia du Niger. Je pense à Cléopâtre, à Tchepsout, Néfertiti de la glorieuse Égypte. Je pense à Ken Bougoul, la femme dont personne ne voulait, n'a pas non plus voulu de l'oppresseur. Je pense à Dia de la Mauritanie. Je pense au redoutable Amazone du Dahomey. Je rends ici hommage aux femmes du Mardi Noir de Nder, les dignes filles du Wallo. Elles sont parties dans les flammes de la liberté. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne. Avec des lettres de sang, elles ont inscrit leur nom en blanc dans l'histoire de mon Afrique noire. Par leur marque indélébile, elles ont ancré dans le cœur des générations à venir le goût de la liberté. Dites leur nom. Elles méritent qu'on s'en souvienne.
Wow. Dites leur nom, say their names. We must remember them. And we started our festival with exactly that, remembering, making sure that, you know, our future is very much grounded in the absolute courage and bravery and intelligence of the women liberators who freed us. Thank you, Lynn, for that beautiful poem. We need to have it up. We need to continue to say it, and it must be part of our anthems if that's what we need to do. So I'm going to close here. Thank you everybody for participating. It's been a brilliant morning. I've done 2 sessions, each of them it was as if we had planned them together, because they went together so well in terms of the 2 themes, reimagining, in terms of the 2 themes around the ideas around our theme for today, reimagining development. So as speakers again, Rachel, Amira, Fatima, and Nilanjana, thanks again. Everybody who's attended, it was a wonderful morning, and we wish you well. I think our next session is going to be in the next, in about, it'll be a bit later on. I think it'll be around in 3 or 4 hours time. I must check that. But that's going to be our big reimagining development tricontinental plenary, like we like big words still. And then that'll be and then we'll have a closing session after that. We hope you'll be able to join us for those 2. Thank you for joining us. Love, solidarity, power, joy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.